On the afternoon of June 14, 1982, in Bay County, Florida, an ordinary workday ended in an act of violence so brutal that it would echo through courtrooms, appeals chambers, and prison corridors for more than 4 decades. The case of Cale Barrington Bates would become one of Florida's longest-running death penalty prosecutions, stretching across generations of judges, lawyers, and grieving family members before ending inside the execution chamber at Florida State Prison on August 19, 2025. What began as a calculated ambush inside a quiet insurance office ultimately evolved into a legal saga defined by confessions, forensic evidence, contested sentencing hearings, constitutional challenges, and relentless appeals that delayed justice for 43 years. Janet Renee White was 24 years old, newly married, and working at a State Farm insurance office in the Florida Panhandle. By all accounts presented during trial testimony, she lived an ordinary life built around work and family. On that June day, Cale Barrington Bates entered the building and waited. Court records later described the attack as deliberate. Bates, who had previously been inside the office during deliveries, knew the layout and the routines. Prosecutors argued he lay in wait for White to return, transforming a familiar workplace into the scene of a premeditated crime. When White came back to the office, Bates confronted her. Evidence introduced at trial showed she resisted fiercely. Investigators documented signs of struggle, injuries consistent with defensive wounds, and evidence that she screamed and fought as she was overpowered. Bates abducted her from the office and forced her into nearby woods behind the building. There, according to findings summarized repeatedly in appellate rulings, he attempted to sexually assault her, stabbed her to death, and tore a diamond ring from her finger before leaving her body in the wooded area. The violence was extreme. Forensic evidence became central to the prosecution's case. Blood and fiber evidence linked Bates directly to the scene, and officers found him nearby shortly after the attack, covered in blood and carrying the victim's ring in his pocket. Court filings later recorded that biological evidence connected him to sexual contact during the assault. Police apprehended Bates quickly, and investigators conducted hours of interrogation. According to defense claims raised decades later, he was questioned for more than 5 hours and subjected to coercive tactics, allegations prosecutors denied and courts ultimately rejected as grounds for overturning the conviction. Bates confessed, and prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, kidnapping, attempted sexual battery, and armed robbery. The 1983 trial unfolded in Bay County amid intense local attention. Prosecutors portrayed Bates as a predator who selected a vulnerable victim and executed a calculated attack driven by sexual violence and theft. The jury convicted him on all counts and recommended death. The judge imposed a death sentence, marking the beginning of what would become one of Florida's longest death row incarcerations. The case quickly entered the appellate system. In 1985, the Florida Supreme Court reviewed aspects of the sentencing phase and required reconsideration of aggravating and mitigating factors, initiating the first in a long series of legal reversals and resentencing proceedings. Over the following years, courts repeatedly examined whether trial counsel had been effective, whether mitigating evidence had been adequately presented, and whether procedural errors influenced sentencing outcomes. Each ruling prolonged the case while leaving the underlying conviction intact. By the late 1980s, Bates faced his first scheduled execution. Defense attorneys filed post-conviction motions arguing ineffective assistance of counsel during sentencing. A trial court agreed in part, vacating the sentence and ordering a new penalty phase. The state appealed, and years of litigation followed before Bates was again resentenced to death in 1995, this time after a jury recommendation that was not unanimous, a feature of Florida's sentencing system that would later become controversial nationwide. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed the renewed death sentence in 1999, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. Still, the litigation did not end. Like many capital cases in the United States, Bates' case moved into federal habeas corpus review, where defense attorneys raised constitutional claims involving jury instructions, mitigation evidence, interrogation procedures, and alleged racial bias. During these decades, Janet White's family continued attending hearings. Her husband, Randy White, later described receiving the call informing him of the murder only minutes after speaking to his wife for the last time. The emotional impact of the crime became a recurring theme during victim impact discussions and public reporting surrounding the execution. Meanwhile, Bates spent more than 40 years on Florida's death row. Prison records documented decades of appeals, motions, and legal filings. Defense lawyers increasingly focused on mental health mitigation, arguing that organic brain damage and trauma had not been fully presented during earlier sentencing proceedings. Courts repeatedly ruled those claims were either previously litigated or raised too late after decades of review. In 2025, the case accelerated toward its conclusion. Governor Ron DeSantis signed a death warrant scheduling Bates' execution for August 19 at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The warrant triggered a final wave of litigation. Bates filed successive motions to vacate his conviction and sentence in state court, arguing newly framed constitutional interpretations and renewed mitigation claims. The Bay County Circuit Court denied the motion after reviewing the record and prior rulings, concluding the arguments had already been addressed or could have been raised earlier. Simultaneously, Bates pursued federal challenges. One lawsuit alleged that Florida's process for selecting execution warrants was racially discriminatory, claiming violations of the 8th and 14th Amendments. Federal courts dismissed the claim, ruling he failed to demonstrate a likelihood of success or sufficient evidence supporting the allegation. Another last-minute filing attempted to reopen a decades-old habeas petition by arguing that a recent U.S. Supreme Court administrative law ruling undermined federal deference standards applied in his earlier appeals. A federal judge rejected the argument, finding no legal basis to reopen the long-finalized case. Outside the courts, advocacy groups and religious organizations urged clemency, arguing that lifelong imprisonment would be more humane and that the death penalty was unnecessary in modern society. Letters were sent to the governor requesting commutation, but no clemency hearing was granted. As execution day approached, courts issued their final rulings. The Florida Supreme Court denied remaining claims, emphasizing that Bates had decades to present the arguments now raised. The United States Supreme Court declined last-minute appeals on the afternoon of August 19, clearing the final legal obstacle. Inside Florida State Prison near Stark, the execution protocol began early that morning. Corrections officials reported Bates woke at 5:15 a.m. He received visits from family members, including his daughter and sister. He declined a last meal and chose not to meet with a spiritual advisor. Witnesses gathered behind the glass of the execution chamber that evening, including Janet White's husband, who had attended proceedings for decades, fulfilling what he described as a promise to see the case through to the end. At 6 p.m., the curtain opened. Bates lay strapped to the gurney as officials administered Florida's 3-drug lethal injection sequence: a sedative, a paralytic agent, and a drug designed to stop the heart. When asked whether he had final words, Bates responded with a single answer: no. The drugs began flowing moments later. At 6:17 p.m. on August 19, 2025, Cale Barrington Bates was pronounced dead. The execution marked Florida's 10th execution of the year, the highest annual total in the state since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1976. For the victim's family, the moment represented the end of a 43-year legal journey. For the courts, it closed a case that had moved through nearly every stage of American capital litigation: conviction, appellate reversal, resentencing, state and federal habeas review, civil rights challenges, and emergency appeals filed within hours of execution. The story of Cale Barrington Bates ultimately became a portrait of the American death penalty system itself, a system defined by exhaustive judicial review, procedural safeguards, and decades-long delays balancing constitutional protections against final punishment. The crime that began in a quiet insurance office in 1982 did not conclude until generations later, when the final order was carried out under fluorescent lights inside a prison chamber, ending one of Florida's longest-running capital cases and closing a chapter that had remained open for more than 4 decades. On the evening of August 28, 2025, inside the execution chamber at Florida State Prison in Stark, correctional officials prepared a 3-drug lethal injection protocol that had ended dozens of lives before him. At 6:17 p.m., after more than 3 decades of legal battles, appeals, and failed attempts to halt his sentence, Curtis Wyndham was pronounced dead. His execution marked Florida's 11th that year, the highest annual total the state had reached since the modern death penalty era began in 1976, closing a case rooted in a violent chain of events that unfolded in a single day in November 1992 and permanently altered multiple families. The story begins not in the execution chamber, but in Central Florida during the early 1990s, a period when drug trafficking, street disputes, and personal conflicts frequently overlapped. Court records later showed that Curtis Wyndham believed a man named Johnny Lee owed him approximately $2,000. On November 7, 1992, a friend informed Wyndham that Lee had recently won money at a Greyhound racetrack. According to testimony presented at trial, Wyndham responded with a chilling prediction: people would soon read about him. Investigators later used that statement to demonstrate intent and premeditation, a critical factor that prosecutors would rely on throughout the case. Within hours, Wyndham drove to a Walmart and legally purchased a .38 caliber revolver along with a box of ammunition. Surveillance timelines and witness testimony placed the purchase shortly before the killings began. Prosecutors argued that the rapid sequence, learning about Lee's money, acquiring a weapon, and immediately seeking him out, illustrated deliberate planning rather than impulsive violence. Lee was standing near his car when Wyndham arrived. Witnesses testified that Wyndham fired from his vehicle, striking Lee twice in the back. He then exited, stood over the wounded man, and fired additional shots at close range. The execution-style manner of the killing became one of the prosecution's strongest arguments during sentencing, reinforcing claims of calculated intent. But the violence did not end there. After killing Lee, Wyndham drove directly to the apartment of his girlfriend, Valerie Davis, the mother of one of his children. Court records described what happened next as unprovoked. Davis was on the phone when Wyndham entered. A witness present inside the apartment watched as he shot her in the chest, killing her almost instantly. The prosecution later emphasized that no immediate argument or confrontation preceded the shooting. As Wyndham fled the apartment, the rampage continued. Outside, he encountered Kenneth Williams and fired at him at close range. Williams survived, becoming a key witness whose testimony helped reconstruct the timeline of events and confirm Wyndham's movements between crime scenes. Meanwhile, Valerie Davis's mother, Mary Lubin, had learned that her daughter had been shot and rushed toward the apartment by car. At a nearby stop sign, Wyndham approached her vehicle. According to court findings later cited by the Florida Supreme Court, he spoke briefly before firing into the car, striking Lubin twice and killing her. Investigators concluded that Lubin had no involvement in the earlier dispute, making her death one of the most tragic elements of the case. In less than a day, 3 people were dead and a 4th seriously wounded. Law enforcement launched an immediate manhunt. Testimony later revealed that relatives and acquaintances attempted to disarm Wyndham shortly after the shootings, suggesting even those close to him recognized the escalating danger. He was eventually apprehended and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder. The prosecution built its case around eyewitness accounts, ballistic evidence linking the Walmart-purchased revolver to all shootings, and statements attributed to Wyndham before the killings. The state argued that each murder demonstrated escalating intent rather than emotional loss of control. Prosecutors also introduced evidence suggesting involvement in drug activity, asserting that disputes connected to narcotics dealings formed part of the motive, though defense attorneys challenged that characterization. At trial, jurors heard testimony describing the sequence of shootings as deliberate and continuous. After conviction, the jury unanimously recommended death sentences for the murders. The trial judge imposed 3 death sentences and an additional 22-year prison term for the attempted murder conviction. The sentencing order cited aggravating factors including prior violent felony history and findings that at least 1 killing was cold, calculated, and premeditated. Wyndham's direct appeal reached the Florida Supreme Court in the mid-1990s. In its ruling, the court affirmed the convictions and death sentences while modifying certain aggravating findings applied by the trial court. The court upheld the overall sentence, concluding that sufficient evidence supported the jury's recommendation of death. The U.S. Supreme Court later declined review, leaving the convictions intact. What followed was a decades-long series of post-conviction challenges, a defining feature of Wyndham's life on death row. His attorneys repeatedly argued that trial counsel had been ineffective, particularly for failing to present extensive mental health mitigation evidence during sentencing. Defense filings claimed jurors were never fully informed about psychological factors that might have influenced his behavior. Florida courts consistently rejected those claims. Judges ruled that even if mental health evidence had been introduced, prosecutors would have countered with damaging information, including allegations of drug dealing and assertions that two victims were police informants. Courts concluded that the absence of additional mitigation evidence did not undermine confidence in the verdict or sentencing outcome. Over the years, Windham filed multiple successive post-conviction motions. By 2025, court records showed at least 5 such attempts seeking relief from his sentence. Each filing raised variations of ineffective counsel claims, due process arguments, or newly discovered evidence assertions. In August 2025, shortly after Governor Ron DeSantis signed a death warrant scheduling the execution for August 28, courts again denied relief and refused to stay the execution. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed the denial, and Windham's final petition for habeas corpus relief was rejected. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene the day before the execution, exhausting the final legal avenue available under federal law. During his 33 years on death row, Windham lived through sweeping changes in American society, technological revolutions, shifting death penalty jurisprudence, and evolving public opinion about capital punishment. Family members maintained contact, including his daughter, who publicly campaigned to stop the execution. She stated that despite the trauma caused by the crimes, she had forgiven her father, highlighting the complicated emotional legacy surrounding the case. Advocacy groups submitted petitions seeking clemency, arguing that lengthy incarceration and claims of mental illness warranted reconsideration. State officials declined intervention, emphasizing the jury's unanimous recommendation and repeated judicial review affirming the sentence. On execution day, Windham was transferred to the death chamber at Florida State Prison. Florida's protocol used a 3-drug sequence: a sedative to induce unconsciousness, a paralytic agent, and a drug that stops the heart. Witnesses observed as officials administered the injection. He was declared dead at 6:17 p.m., officially concluding one of Florida's longest-running capital cases from the early 1990s crime wave era. The execution carried broader significance beyond a single case. Florida had issued an unusually high number of death warrants in 2025, surpassing previous execution totals and leading the United States that year. Windham became the 11th person executed in the state within months, reflecting a renewed pace of capital punishment enforcement. For investigators and prosecutors, the case remained defined by the rapid escalation of violence on November 7, 1992, a sequence that began with a personal dispute over money and ended with 3 deaths across multiple locations within hours. For defense attorneys and abolition advocates, it represented a decades-long debate over mental health, representation quality, and the fairness of capital sentencing. In the end, court rulings consistently framed the crimes as intentional and premeditated acts supported by eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and Windham's own statements before the shootings. After more than 30 years of appeals, every reviewing court upheld the convictions and sentences, concluding that constitutional standards had been met. And so the case of Curtis Windham closed where many death penalty cases ultimately do, not with resolution for every person affected, but with a legally final judgment carried out after decades of litigation, leaving behind a permanent record of violence, grief, and a justice system that had revisited the same question repeatedly before delivering its irreversible answer.